Chapter 12. Good shot, the young man called out as the arrow cut through the air, arcing towards the straw target before burying itself until only the feather fletching was visible. Ciela looked very serious as she withdrew another arrow from its quiver, knocking it in place before turning her head sideways to look at her target. Keeping her posture straight, her hands came into view as she pulled back on the bowstring as the hand holding the bow pushed forward. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and it swayed in the gentle breeze for a moment before she loosed another shot, keeping her eyes on the target until the arrow struck true. She had been a natural with the bow, taking to it with great relish under the tutelage of a local boy named Turf, who was frequently found any excuse to be around her. He was younger than her by a year, but was solidly built with the tan, muscular frame of someone who was not afraid of labouring in the fields under a hot summer sun. A shock of blonde hair erupted from his head, no more than a few inches in length. Despite his mother's best efforts, they had never been able to tame his mane, much like the young man himself, as his father had liked to joke. Initially, they were not going to stay for long in the town of Pinehurst, but some of the more senior folks had pointed out that they were without a blacksmith, and someone of Hitch's skills was sorely needed for a number of repairs that had piled up in the rural community and projects that could be commissioned. Hitch had been resistant at first, eager to be back on the road with his wares until the subject of payment had been raised. It was decided then that they would stay for a while so that Ciela could rest up and be ready for the next leg of their journey. The old blacksmith shop was cleaned out and made ready, and through the town rung again to the sound of the smith's hammer on the anvil. The weapons and armour meant for market were tucked away out of sight. Hitch was sure that the good folks of Pinehurst would not have enough steel pieces to match his prices, or the ability to avoid the temptation of trying to steal some either. Your turn now. Cielo handed the sturdy long bow to Turf. It was almost as tall as they were. While archery was considered a good sport to occupy your time, the practical people here only practiced with proper hunting equipment. They walked to the target to retrieve the arrows, pulling them from the straw before returning to the stick they had placed in the ground to mark their spot. I have taken many a deer with this, Turf bragged as he loosed the shaft. It sailed through the air, striking the target fair in the middle. As he knocked another arrow, Cielo commented, "And I've killed a dragon man with my crossbow." Fingers slipping, the bowstring shot forward, flinging the arrow off wildly to the side. He turned to look at her with great skepticism. "Liar! You're just saying that to throw me off." Cielo's eyes flared with anger for a moment. This was the first time she had revealed anything of her travels with Hitch. He had warned her to keep these things to herself. The humans of the plains might have been friends with the dwarves in the mountains, or secretly aligned with the dragon man that had stalked the forests. She had taken his warning to heart, but had forgotten herself in the heat of the moment. "What would you know? You've never been anywhere." Cielo turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. Turf took out another arrow, holding it knocked by his waist, as he looked at the target, trying to pose as heroically as possible. "If I hit the center, I win a kiss from a princess." Cielo looked back over her shoulder at him as he tried his best not to notice her. He raised the bow up into his eye line. Slowly breathing out, he waited until all the air had left his lungs. In the moment before he would naturally want to draw back in his breath, he fired, his body remaining still, his hand the only part in motion as it let go of the bowstring. Their heads moved in unison, tracking the arc of the arrow, the moment stretching out as Cielo prayed it would miss its mark. Rear rocks left her in that moment as the shaft found its target, thudding into the smallest circle painted in the middle of the straw. Turf broke out into a broad smile, leaning on the bow as he stared at his handiwork with a look of great satisfaction on his face. He refused to acknowledge Cielo was even there. "Well?" she asked, her body tensing with anxiety. She was unsure of how she felt right now, other than awkward. "Well, what?" Turf asked innocently as he turned towards her. "You hit the mark. Aren't you going to try and collect your kiss from the princess?" Taking a half step backwards, he replied, "I would if but one were here before me. You see, princesses are beautiful, and you are..." He let his sentence trail off as he turned to run, Cielo springing into action a half-second later to take off after him running. His laughter died as he looked over his shoulder to see a very determined young woman, her face scrunched up in outrage, hot on his heels. Panic gripped him for a moment as he redoubled his efforts to pump his arms and legs harder until his breathing became ragged. His foot catching on an uneven piece of ground as he fell, twisting in the air as his bow left his hand and the arrow sprayed out of his quiver. Cielo leapt like a striking cat sailing through the air, her hands gripping his shoulders a moment before they came crashing down onto the soft grassy field. Oof! The air blasted out of his lungs as her weight dropped onto him. "What were you going to say?" she demanded as she shook him by the shoulders. "Say it." His hands came up, the fingers digging into her ribs. She started to squirm away, doing her best to hold her grip and composure. "Say what?" he asked innocently, as he dug his fingers in deeper. She burst out laughing, her hands flashing from his shoulders to his forearms, trying to make him stop. They struggled for a moment longer, her face flushing red. He threw up his arms, signaling his defeat. Sitting up, they found themselves face to face, trying to recover their breath. "You win," Turf said before darting forward to gently kiss her on the lips. She flinched, pulling back for a moment. He suddenly felt like he had made a terrible mistake, but she just patted him on the shoulder and quickly sprang to her feet. He leapt back up as well, and they quickly gathered up the bow and arrows before heading off back to town. They didn't have much to say to each other as they trudged through the high grasses, doing their best to avoid making eye contact. "Next time we play for something else," Cielo said while keeping her gaze straight ahead. "Agreed," Turf quickly replied. Parting ways near the edge of the town, Cielo headed to her new home at the blacksmith shop to check up on Hitch. "Nice of you to join me," Hitch called out as she came into view. He bowed as though he were addressing royalty. "You said I could go practice archery." Cielo looked up in exasperation until she saw the gleaming mirth in Hitch's expression. She grabbed her gloves and apron before joining Hitch by the forge. She sat on a stool nearby and watched as he pulled a piece of glowing iron from the forge and started working the shape with his hammer. "While you've been off running around, I've been making these all morning." He held it up to her for a moment before going back to hammering it into a curving shape. Everyone near and far needs horseshoes." The work was easy and boring for someone used to crafting weapons of exquisite appearance and strength, but the coppers had been piling up. Hitch missed his forge, though. The setup here was barely adequate at best, he would often grumble, and didn't allow him to produce his finest work. "Been talk to that boy again?" "Sod, is it?" Hitch cocked an eyebrow as he glanced at her over the glowing iron. "Turf, and you very well know it," she decried in exasperation at another one of his jokes at her friend's expense. She didn't know why, but she felt very defensive of him, and always rose to the bait when Hitch would joke about the boy's name or appearance. "And yes, we had an archery competition today where there was a prize at stake." Hitch continued to gently tap the piece of iron as it started to fade to a dull red. "Oh, aye? And what was the prize then?" "You have no money." Hitch chuckled to himself, thinking about what they could possibly trade. Mud pies? The thought set him to chuckling some more. "A kiss." Hitch missed the iron, the heavy hammer striking the anvil a glancing blow that caused him to trip part way over. He recovered his balance, turning back to flick the iron from his tongs into the forge, where it landed, setting up a blooming shower of sparks. "Kissing!" He whirled back to her, coming around the anvil to stand in front of her. She wasn't too surprised by his reaction, as he had always been very protective of her. "It was just a little peck," she teased, turning her head to the side and swinging her feet back and forth like an innocent child without a care in the world. He stopped in front of her, his hands balled into fists on his hips. "And I liked it," she cried joyfully as she leapt to her feet and took off running around behind the forge. "That's it," he thundered as he took off after her. "We're leaving tomorrow where we can find a nice tower to lock you in." He jogged around the forge as she skipped ahead. Maybe a moat as well, for good measure. He stopped and reversed course, hoping to catch her off guard. She was too quick, though, and sprang back, keeping an equal distance between them. Bah! I'm too old to go chasing you around. He had already started to feel puffed and leaned on the anvil for a moment to catch his breath. He had been working for hours now, and the hot air of a forge always seemed to tax the lungs. He turned at the movement in the corner of his eyes to see Ciela was already outside, climbing along the low stone wall at the back of their yard. He stopped to watch her as she stepped carefully along the uneven stones, her arms out by her side for balance. She paused for a moment before turning on the ball of one foot, gracefully swinging herself around to face the direction she had just come from. She looked so carefree. The problems of the world could never touch her as she skipped and jumped along that wall while the sun beamed down on her. Hitch smiled to himself, his heart fit to burst, as he couldn't recall what his life had been like before she had come into it, or what he would do if they were ever parted. Wiping the corner of his eye, which had started to moisten, he turned back to the forge and the horseshoes waiting to be shaped.